Pick one. You're not right there. You're over here.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can wait for someone down. Go over here. Oh, wait. We're waiting on it. Yeah, we weren't waiting on it. She took things. You'll get me started?
Yeah, no.
Okay. All right, we are going to go ahead and call this meeting to order. To begin the meeting, we need to select a chair for the budget committee. Would anybody like to make a nomination?
I would like to nominate Matt Kaufman as the Budget Committee Chair.
Wonderful. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Hans. Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Is anyone opposed? No, okay. I gotta count. Motion carries how many? 10-0? Okay. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and turn this over to our new budget committee chair. You're in the wrong spots? Is this yours? Oh.
So
You bring up the PowerPoint, please. So Chair Kaufman, I'll let you go. I gave you some roles of the budget committee there on a piece of paper that I left for you. At least I intended to. If I didn't, it's sitting on my desk.
Do we need to adjourn?
all right, welcome everyone to, oh, should I start now?
Yes, we can.
Oh, to this year's budget committee meeting. The following defines the scope and responsibility of the budget committee as the whole. Budget committee is a group of school board members and citizens that reviews the school district's proposed budget. The committee is composed of the school board and an equal number of citizens. The budget committee is a means for the public to participate in the budgeting process. The public is encouraged to attend because one of the most important purposes of the committee is to take comments and questions from interested citizens. The budget committee receives the budget message and the budget document from the superintendent. The committee reviews the proposed budget, listens to comments from citizens, and approves the budget. The budget committee reviews the proposal to ensure that the district is planning to spend money in furtherance of expressly stated district goals. The committee reviews the budget at a public meeting, which is this meeting. The committee approves the budget at the major fund and function level and sets the tax rate. Once complete, the budget committee refers to the budget to the school board. The school board adopts the budget. The budget committee does not approve new personnel, set salaries, benefits, or contract terms for employees or administrators. It is also outside the committee's scope of work to set staffing levels or decide whether or not a service or program should be provided. The budget committee does not make district policies. The budget committee's work is complete after it has approved a proposed budget. And
Okay, thank you, Chair Kaufman. I put these into slides as well, just so you could take a look at them in visual purposes. So really, first, I just want to start by thanking all of you for your service this evening and for coming here tonight. We know many of you are missing T-ball games, baseball games, sacrificing time with your family. We appreciate you being here in service of your community. The role of the Budget Committee is listed up there. It's pretty straightforward. It's an opportunity for the public to participate. So it's the board and the 5 Budget Committee members that come in and participate in this. You will receive or have received the budget message and budget document. There is a budget document sitting in front of you. It looks like this, and it contains what is the official budget document for the district. It includes those tables I shared last time, plus some additional information. You review the proposed budget, and if we have any public comment, you listen to input from citizens. You review the budget at a major fund and function level, making sure that we're in line with district goals, and making sure it's reasonable and justifiable based on prior year's work. And that was part of our challenge before, where I think we didn't present the information in a way that gave you enough information to really be able to do that, I think, and that led to some budget challenges for us. And so tonight, I think I hope there's enough information. If there's not, we can talk about it and we can fix that you can make that decision and see if it's a viable budget for next year. So then you'll approve the budget and you'll set the tax rate. Once you complete that process, the work of the Budget Committee is done. And at a board meeting, we have a budget hearing. There's another opportunity for public comment. And then if the board chooses, they would adopt the budget at that meeting. As Chair Kaufman said, there's a few things outside of the scope of the Budget Committee. And these are things that are the scope of the board and staff, depending on which one they are. Any questions about the role of the Budget Committee or about how the process works?
Just to add one thing for anybody who's new to I think we have some new members this cycle. Over the last year, we instituted a new process I guess it's not technically a Budget Committee process, but we did meet with the auditor and for the first time this year and ask questions, try to sync up what we're doing as a Budget Committee with the financial statement audit that we receive set in March.
I think we did that in January.
January.
Late January, early February. And then I think you presented to the board in March.
And then we presented that to the board. So that's another new procedure that we've put alongside all of the work that Gary's done over the last 2 years to improve the quality of the reports that we're going to get today.
I think in general, we're trying to make things more public, more transparent, and have more checks and balances so that if there is issues, we can foresee them sooner and head them off sooner and not be surprised, sort of regardless of who's in this chair. Okay, so the basic plan for tonight, we already reviewed the role of the Budget Committee. The first thing that typically happens in this message is the superintendent reads their budget message. So Superintendent Lyon will do that in just a minute. We'll go through the budget document in some detail. Some of you have asked me some questions about that. I believe I have my questions in your notes. If I miss something, just be sure to let me know and I'd be happy to go into it. Or if you have other questions, obviously just feel free to ask. We'll take public comment. Then there can be some deliberation. And then if you believe this is a viable budget, then you would vote to approve the budget at the end of the meeting. So let's just jump in and Superintendent Lyon, if you want to read your budget message, that would be fantastic.
Thank you. And just for some context, I think it's really important. The superintendent's budget message typically goes up to the 30,000-foot view and tries to capture for each year of an operation, school district's operation, really kind of the context of what's happening with the things that are inside of that budget. And like so many budget messages in Oregon, it for decades has reflected the problems at the state level for adequate funding, and this one does as well. But I really believe that it's important to actually read the document into the record aloud so that those people, it's part of that public record as opposed to something that's just buried within the budget document. So please bear with me.
It's also on page 3 of your budget document if you want to read along and jot down any notes or whatever.
Dear Sherwood Budget Committee members, and I'd also like to echo Gary's thank you for serving. We have a really, really great committee, and I appreciate that. Dear Sherwood Budget Committee members, this evening we are presenting the 2024-25 proposed budget for the Sherwood School District. The budget is built upon appropriations from the state legislature of $10.2 billion for K-12 education for the 23-25 biennium. This school year has been a strong one from a financial standpoint for the district. Ending fund balance in the general fund is anticipated to essentially double from $945,602 at the end of the 22-23 school year to just under $2 million at the end of the 23-24 school year. In addition, the district started the year with negative sub-fund balances in excess of $1 million. Those negative balances have been eliminated. This is good first progress for the first year of a multi-year recovery. As strong as this year was, more work remains to be done. The current projected ending fund balance in the general fund is less than 3% of projected revenues. Board policy and best practices calls for a minimum ending fund balance of 8%. The district will need to remain disciplined for the next several years to reach the 8% target by the end of the 2027 school year. The story for 2023-24 school year could have been much different if not for the support of the Sherwood community. In the summer of 2022, fiscal staff uncovered significant budgetary challenges. $2.2 million in reductions were put in place in November of 2022. With those reductions, the district had operating revenues that were larger than operating expenditures for the first time in several years. However, without the support of a local option levy, the district would have been forced to make an additional $6 million in reductions for the 2023-2024 school year. These cuts would have been devastating to our students, staff, and community. Fortunately, the generous voters in Sherwood overwhelmingly passed a local option levy of $1.50 per thousand of assessed value. This levy is expected to raise just under $5.8 million in 2023-24 and is anticipated to raise just over $6 million in the next fiscal year. This levy allowed the district to maintain programs and staffing and make significant progress towards restoring the fiscal health of the district. Looking ahead to 2024-25, the levy continues to be a huge support to the district. Districts across the state, including some of our neighboring districts, are facing significant cuts. In some cases, these reductions are catastrophic. Without the levy, Sherwood would be in the same boat. Even with the levy in place, funds from the state are inadequate to support our current operations, and reductions will be required. Fortunately, the reductions will be minor compared to others across the state, and all are anticipated to come through attrition. That's people retiring and people leaving the district. The cause of the reductions across the state is largely due to the fact that funding from the state does not keep up with the cost of doing business. This is a multi-factor problem. One problem has to do with unfunded mandates. In the 2023 legislative session, a new law was passed allowing classified staff who work less than 12 months a year to claim unemployment benefits. This is expected to cost the district up to $800,000 in the 2024-25 school year. The challenge the district faces is not with the law, but with the fact that this new law was unfunded and affects every district across the state. Another problem has to do with current service level, called CSL, a calculation used as the baseline for starting the conversation for statewide funding K-12 schools. The calculation itself is deeply flawed. To put this into context, the CSL calculation provided to the state legislature during the most recent session allocated $10.2 billion, suggested that funding schools at $9.52 billion would allow them to maintain current services. The legislature allocated $10.2 billion to K-12 education, and districts across the state are still making significant reductions. School funding in Oregon will not markedly improve until mandates are fully funded and accounted for in a revamped CSL calculation. Looking more locally, while Sherwood does not need to make significant reductions, some are necessary. There are cost drivers out of our control, and funding from the state does not cover these increased costs. Given that the district will be reducing 7.7 positions in teaching staff called full-time equivalents, FTE. That includes 5 elementary teachers, 2 middle school teachers, a 0.5 pre-K teacher, and 0.2 FTE in elementary music. Again, all of these cuts coming through attrition. In addition, this district will reduce 4.41 special education instructional assistants. 3 of those positions were in the budget, but were not hired last year. The other 1.41 FTE was lost to attrition. While these reductions pale in comparison to what other districts are going through, there will be a significant impact here in Sherwood, and without the levy, it would be far, far worse. This budget was constructed with the idea of maintaining services and programming to the greatest extent possible, in line with the pledge made by the district surrounding the passage of the levy. It will be up to the next superintendent, a very capable superintendent, to engage in a strategic planning process and chart the course for what is next in Sherwood. Future budgets will likely reflect their vision and the vision of the community for their schools. The district is in a great position to take that next step. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lyon. So we'll move into the budget. The first slide I've got in here actually comes from a question that Director Moeller asked me via email. And he wanted to have some information about the growth in special education students and funding. And I couldn't really answer it quite the way it was asked, but I can provide some context, at least not in a way that would be understandable to people who aren't deeply involved in special education law. But I can provide some context here. So this slide across the top, when you see that ADMW, that means average daily membership weighted. And that is what we get our funding based on. And that includes the number of students and the additional weights we get for those students. So the ADMR down below is where it says SSD. That is the number of students that actually attended the school district during each of those years. The charter school is on the line below it. And there's the district's total ADMR. And the reason I included both is we provide special education services for the charter school. So to really get a sense of the number of SPED students we serve, we have to include the charter school as well to make that accurate. And when we take all the weights, if you look in 2017-18, you see that our ADMR, we actually had 5,325 students in the district, but we got funded at a number of 5,809, that ADMW. That includes all the weights for the students that they get as extra weights. So special education students, for example, we get 2.0 weights for them. We get an extra full weight for them. We get weights for students navigating poverty. We get weights for homeless youth, students emerging bilingual, students learning to speak English. So those are the contexts. So you can see there's a couple interesting things on here. You can just look at our enrollment path where here we peaked in 17-18, had a small decline, a little bit more decline in 19-20. Then the pandemic hit and we had a pretty precipitous drop, started to build back up. And then in this year, our numbers are lower again. You can see the number of special education students kind of tracks with that with a big drop. But what's interesting is when we had 5,700 special education students, we had 5,258 students in the district. We had 585 special education students. That percentage dropped, as you can see, but it's now back up higher than it was before. And even though we have fewer students than we had prior to the pandemic, we have roughly the same number of special education students. And so that was a good way to kind of show the difference in that growth relative to our other population. The other question that was asked was around funding, and it's really complicated to try to parse out how much is spent on students on IEPs and how much is spent on regular ed students. But I put one example in here. And this is we just reconciled our high cost disability grant. So the high cost disability grant reimburses us. If we have a student that it costs us over $30,000 in a year to educate, The high cost disability fund reimburses us for the dollars over and above $30,000. So we bring in about $11,000 per student. So about $22,000 per special education student, and anything over $30,000 we can submit and reimburse for. So for the 2022-23 school year, we submitted $1.8 million worth of expenses that we thought met that mark. ODE approved 945,000 of them. And because the grant has been stagnant at $55 million for the whole state for years and the costs keep going up, we got just about 40% of what was approved. And we ended up with $387,000 in reimbursement against those expenses. And so I was just trying to put in context what's a little bit of special education funding and how that looks for districts. The other thing that's a challenge is the cap on special education funding is 11%. So we get an extra weight for kids up until 11%. Anything over 11%, we don't get the extra weight for, and we need to serve those students out of our general fund budget. And we're actually closer to the 11% than most districts around us. Most districts have a bigger gap than we do, actually. But it's a challenge across the state and across the country. That number's been in place since 1994 and hasn't changed. And so there's a lot of call to revamp that, and I don't know if it will happen or not.
So when you say there's a lot of call to revamp it, who do we know specifically that's working on that on behalf of the education system?
Well, I don't know. It's a federal law, so I don't know who's advocating for it. I just hear calls regularly from advocacy groups that we need to change this law and we're working on it. But I can't tell you who specifically is lobbying at a federal level on this specific topic. But OSBA and COSA typically work with lobbyists, but they're more on the state level and they have partners in the federal level, but I can't tell you who it is exactly.
Gary, just one clarification was you mentioned, and I missed it. You mentioned the cap is 11%, which means, what does that mean?
So if you look at these percentages, these percentages here are the percentages of special education students relative to our total student population. And so we receive extra weighting for the first 11% of SPED students we receive, and anything over 11% we do not receive any weighting for. So for example, looking at this chart, in 2021-22, we received an extra weight for all of our students because we were below 11%. And this year and last year, we received an extra weight for not all of our students because we're over that cap. Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions about this slide or comments? Question in advance was very helpful because I couldn't have explained this without having a little bit of time to prepare a visual for you to look at. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump on in. I just want to talk a little bit about how we do accounting here. And if you look at page 6 in your budget document, you can get an overview of our funds. School districts use what's called fund accounting, and we track funds in dollars or track our dollars in funds, and each fund has a different specific purpose. And so there's some notes in there that you can look at and read while I'm talking. It's on page 6. The general fund, the 100 fund, is the least restrictive fund. It's our main operating funds for the district. That's where our state school funds and property taxes, local taxes we collect like building rentals and things like that, preschool tuition, all that goes into the general fund. The 200 funds, the special revenue funds, those are more restrictive. And that is where most of our grants sit. And we have a sub-fund for each grant. And the idea behind that is if it's sitting in I see people looking for it. Is it not on page 6? Okay, perfect. Making sure my notes were correct. No, that's totally fine. I just wanted to make sure. Special revenue funds contain our grants. There's all kinds of different grants, each with different parameters, each with different reporting, each with different requirements for us to follow. All of the new money basically coming into education is coming in the form of grants in the 200 fund. It's more bureaucratic for us to process. It takes more time and money. But it does allow legislators and lawmakers to choose how we spend the money. And that can be a good thing because a lot of times, like with the new literacy grant that came out, they are requiring district to spend the money on things that have research and evidence that make sure that kids can read better by the time they leave 3rd grade. And so it can be a very positive thing. It just can be a challenge to administer. So it's a good and a bad. There are other things in our 200 funds. We keep things like our construction excise tax, student body funds sit in there, our athletics funds is in there. There's a lot of things that sit in our special revenue funds. The 300 fund is a debt service fund. That's where we pay back our debt on our general obligation bonds that we use to build the new high school and all the other construction projects we've done. We have a capital projects fund where the bond funds and other funds go for capital projects like construction, remodeling, deferred maintenance. There's also things like instructional materials and technology in the capital improvement fund as well, the capital projects fund. And then the 600 fund is a new fund for us. And that is, it's called an internal service fund. And you heard about changes to the unemployment law in our fiscal update a week ago and in Superintendent Lyons' letter. And that internal service fund, that's where we'll collect funds for and pay our unemployment costs out of to track it separately. And that's the way my mentors and our auditors are all telling us to do it, that's the best way is to set up the separate fund, basically charge ourselves a fringe rate on the payroll, collect the funds for unemployment in that fund, and then pay our bills for unemployment out of that fund. So that's a new fund for us, something we haven't had before. And that's what that is. Any questions just about the fund overview? Okay, for those of you who love numbers, you're going to probably like the next few slides, the next maybe 20 slides. For those of you who aren't so crazy about numbers, hang with me, ask questions. So let's start by looking at the general fund. And this just goes in the same order as your budget document or the budget tables I passed out before. You'll see that the tables look largely the same, although the color's not as bright on the screen. So this is our general fund revenue summary. In this, you can see that our total revenue is up about 5.98%, but our operating revenue is up more like 5.15% when you take out the fund balance. One of the questions that was asked earlier was, what is the 5400 account? Mr. Boatsman asked that question. Anything in the 5,000 other sources, not anything down here. These are our fund balances. This is our fund balance right here that we'll open the year with. What we're projecting we'll open the year with. And if you pull that out, our operating revenues go up by about 5.15%. And if you pull the contingency out down below, our operating expenditures go up by about 5.82%. So within this year, our revenues are exceeding our expenses on the operation side by just a little bit. Okay, general fund revenue. Couple questions, a couple things worth pointing out on this one. There's a couple things that I want to talk about. One question I received was in this interest earnings line, why is interest down by 25% next year? Are we having less invested? Or are we worried about interest rates? And right now we're earning about 5.25% on our funds. And I'm just not convinced that that's sustainable over the course of a year. So we'll actually have a little bit more invested, but I'm unwilling to bet that it's going to stay that high. And so we dropped it by 25%, figuring that over the course of the year, that might be a good guess. Another interesting piece on here that we need to take a look at is actually on the next slide. And that is our basic school support. And you can see this is our state school fund dollars. This is where we get a lot of our money from the state, a bulk of our money from the state. And I've got it increasing by 5.35%. And when we get money from the state, we get 49% in the first year of the biennium, 51% in the second year of the biennium. So that's a 4% increase, yet that number is going up by 5.35%. That is the extra students that we're hoping are going to show up in our district next year. That's why that's a different number. I thought it was important to point that out. And I also do need to talk a little bit about enrollment. We discussed at our last fiscal update, we were expecting about 60 more students to come in. And about this time of year, each year, we start tracking enrollment for the following year. We roll our students all forward in the system. We process the kindergarten registrations we've gotten to date. And we keep pretty detailed data from year to year about where we are within each week, each year, so we can look back and look at patterns. And I just have to tell you that the news is not great for next year. We're not seeing the kids in the system that we would like to see right now. Now, we get a bunch of registrations. The bulk of our registrations come over the summer and right at the end of summer. And so it's not time to panic. But it is time to pay attention. And I just wanted to let people know that we're tracking that, but that it is possible that we will not get those kids. And if we don't, we will have to make further reductions to adjust for the loss of those students. And this seems to be a pattern in other districts. Other districts are seeing this same pattern. We don't know exactly what this is, but we'll keep an eye on it, and we'll keep you informed as we learn more.
Greg, should I wait till the end to ask you questions?
No, please jump in anytime.
Previous, and I'm just gonna ask questions I should have asked.
No, it's great.
Private donations, I see there was a $33,000, 335. Is that something we can promote? Is that a one-time thing, or is that? it was back on
Private donations.
1929,
Oh,
1929?
that was back in 2021, 22. Most of our private donations end up in the 200 funds. And most of our private donations come in for things like athletics. We have like an athletics booster, band boosters. We get a lot of donations to our special education programming. I honestly don't know what that private donation into the general fund.
That's what I was
is-
wondering. It just stuck out, so I wasn't sure if they're normally being elsewhere. Miscellaneous receipts, I see that's going up and down fairly significantly. What does that number represent?
going down
Well, 214, 36, 581.
all over the map. Yeah, that's a great question. So this year we made a decision. So I kind of have to take you back a little bit. So we had student body funds, and we had some things mixed into student body funds. Student body funds have a really narrow definition of what they account for. And so we looked at what that definition was, and we had a lot of funds sitting outside of student body funds. And so we decided to kind of clean that up and move those out of student body funds. We made the decision to move some of those things that were in student body funds, and one of those was actually like athletics fundraising was sitting in student body funds. And we made a decision to move those into the general fund. And we should have moved them into the 200 funds. And the reason being is it was skewing our ending fund balance. When somebody would give a donation to the athletics program, it would appear as revenue in our general fund. And so we moved those to the 200 fund. We transferred those back. The reason that it went down and then up and then down a little bit more is some things made sense to stay in the general fund. We used to charge fees. I don't know if those of you had high school kids for a while, we used to charge a lot of fees for high school courses. Like you had to pay $60 to take wood shop and this much to take this class. And we eliminated all those fees and now pay for those. So we've moved the teachers' budgets for those fees, the teachers' budgets for those courses. They are general fund expenses because they're part of our operations. And so that's representative of the $306,000 that's in there. But we moved out the other stuff that was donations and other stuff that were skewing our fund balance and weren't really general funds. So sort of a complex answer, but does that make sense? We're correcting things. We should have never moved them into the general fund in the first place. That was on me. And we fixed it.
One more question, sorry, you guys. On line 3110, the 3,000, the high cost disability grant, does that have a timeline? Does that have a sundown period, or is that?
So the question was, what about the high cost disability grant? That is an annual grant we receive. And that's the one that I was talking about earlier, where we submitted all those expenditures and ended up getting $387,000 was what they gave us. That's the high cost disability grant. We apply for it each year, and we're trying to get more and more sophisticated about how we apply for it, because how you account for funds in one year affects what you get the next year. And so we're trying to increase our funding. So we're hopeful that we can get another $60,000, $70,000 out of that. And that's reflective of the $450 for next year.
Just a question back to enrollment. When we're looking at, in the future and projected enrollment, and most of the enrollment happens, when did you say? Okay, so when do you start to get notice of people unenrolling within the district?
We're actually trying to put a progress process in place to start tracking people better when they leave the district at the end of the year. Just not only to know they're leaving, but to make sure we get like library books and things like that back. Trying to the processes are in place, but we're really trying to tighten that up a little bit. And a lot of families let us know they move. And a lot of families just leave and they never even tell us. The kids just don't show up for school and they're gone. Or they leave over the summer and don't tell us. And when we really learn is when they enroll in their next school and the school sends us a request for records. That's sometimes how we learn. Sometimes we learn from the family. Sometimes we learn from another school. Sometimes we learn when they don't show up for the first few days of school. It kind of depends. That is one of the challenges. And our enrollment typically goes up and peaks about the first day of school. And then we start getting those record requests and then it actually drops back down a little bit as a typical pattern.
We also track it weekly. We have a weekly
Yeah,
update, a rolling count that we bring to our executive team meeting every Monday.
yeah.
So we're watching it actually on a weekly basis as well.
Would it, for projection purposes, would it be beneficial to send out some form of, at the previous district I was at, with my kids several years back, it was around this time, I want to say every year, we were sent a survey asking if we intended to stay in the district, if our plans were to stay in the district for the following year. And when we're looking at projection of enrollment and already concerning that that may not be what we're thinking it's going to be, and then couple that with conversations you hear in the community about people planning to unenroll for one reason or another, I'm just wondering if that would be a good idea to start doing.
Yeah, I think that's something we could put in place. In fact, we talked about that at a meeting yesterday, we were looking at it more of sending out, if you're going to leave, please let us know, and here's the process we'd like you to go through. And so we can talk about what that looks like, but I think something like that needs to be in place. Yeah, I would agree.
Okay.
And when I was talking about tightening it up, that's part of it, is just some families don't know they need to let us know they're leaving.
Right, right. But for like, I mean, obviously this year it would be later, but in the future, if there's something that can be done, during the budgeting process, so that we have kind of an idea going into this of the maintenance number, right, that we're going to maintain versus new enrollment. I think that'd be helpful.
Yeah, it would be helpful, and it would be just another check on our enrollment, the way we track it. It tends to follow sort of broader patterns. It's hard to manage at a student level, but it would be good to know if we had more or less leave. It would take us a while to build a database of how that played out over time, but that's a good idea.
I think as a reminder too, when we had talked about the previous meeting about tightening up our release numbers, come spring, I hope that's a part of the conversation as well as tying into.
I agree on that.
Okay. Other questions on this general fund revenue detail?
As a parent of an incoming kindergartner, I'm
One more.
panicking, wondering whether or not we have our registration at.
So you know what was interesting about that? I went down and asked our programmer, kind of making sure that nothing had changed from year to year when we track our online registrations. And he did tell me that there was like 78 unsubmitted applications. So people who'd started on their process, but just haven't gathered all the paperwork. What we don't know is how many of those are unsubmitted in a typical year at this time. Is there always 78 unsubmitted? And a little less than half of those were kindergartners. And so we'll keep watching it. We get a bulk of our enrollment after this point in time, so it's early in the process. I just wanted to let people know, and I mainly wanted to let people know, budgets are obsolete the day they're passed typically, and we just have to manage this budget on a daily, weekly basis and make sure that we keep it within the parameters that we need to. Okay, the general fund expenses, there's just a ton of numbers here. And I mainly wanted to just I don't want to walk through each line item because I think you'd probably glaze over. But I do want to provide an opportunity for any people that have questions about any of these. So we're looking at general fund expenditures, the sort of the next level slides. With any questions on the salary slide or the benefits slide, which would be the associated payroll costs?
If I'm jumping ahead, tell me, but what are periodicals?
Periodicals. Let's see, where are
Under
you?
the 400. Is that what that is?
Those would be like magazines, like Junior Scholastic or something along those lines.
Alright.
Where are we? Periodicals. Yeah, that would be, could be subscriptions for our libraries that get magazines. A lot of social studies classrooms get Junior Scholastic magazines, or sometimes there's science magazines that teachers purchase. It's a lot of money, but if you think about it, serving 5,000 or 4,500 students, so you know it's $3 a kid maybe.
Can you explain, right under that, the graduation line?
That is expenditures directly related to graduation. That's part of the high school budget, and that's everything from flowers and supplies and things they have to rent. I don't know exactly what's in there, but graduation is a fairly expensive thing to put on.
I'm not questioning that. I'm just saying, why is it $0 for the 22 and 23 and then 22,000 and then it goes down 10,000 for projected and then
I don't know why it was 0 in those previous years. I'm guessing they put it into a different account code is what happened. I imagine the expenditure's been there all along. And the high school budgets for this part of it, each school puts in their own budget and it all rolls in here. So I don't know exactly why it went down. Perhaps they had some larger one-time expenditures they had to buy. I'm not totally sure, to be honest with you.
Can I sneak up a little bit? 331 and 332, what defines reimbursable transport or non-reimbursable transport?
Great question. So reimbursable transport, so our transportation grant from the state, we get reimbursed 70% for transporting students. And so there are certain things that we can get reimbursed for, and there's other things that we cannot. So like athletics, we cannot get reimbursed, and that is non-reimbursable transportation. Reimbursable transport. And so these are purchased services. These aren't our drivers delivering it. So if we have reimbursable transport, we have students we have to transport all over the metro area. For example, if we have a student who is needs a placement in another district for a special need, we have to transport that student to that district. Or if we have a variety of reasons, students living, like if we had a family who was homeless and they wanted to attend, and they had attended Sherwood schools before they became homeless, we would transport them for wherever they were staying to our school district. We don't always have sufficient buses to do that, so there's services that provide that for us, and we contract with them to drive those services around. Plus, it's less expensive to put them in a car with one person than drive a bus all the way across town. That makes sense?
It does. And then, so is that reimbursed to the Sherwood schools, or is that reimbursed to a particular party?
We pay that party, and then we're reimbursed by the state 70% of that cost through the transportation grant. So these are our expenses, and then we're reimbursed 70% of that. And sometimes for athletics, we just need to hire a bus because we don't have enough buses to take 4 kids worth of track athletes to the meet.
My eye goes to, and I understand that a lot of this is stuff that wasn't itemized out before, but is itemized out now, but I have to ask, when I see percentage raises of like 732%, like, what is the Portland Community College? Why has that been so low? And then suddenly it's jumping to 16. And I have the same question about,
Which line item are you on? I'm sorry.
I'm on in the 300s. So this is
372.
372. Thank you.
I would like to know, I don't know what these are, but the tuition public, I'm assuming that's lease.
Yeah, I can
yep.
address both of those.
Yeah, I mean, some of these are just like big increases where it's hard to understand.
So when I saw that Portland Community College, I had the same question. I think what's happening there is that this is again in a high school budgeting line item where they budget for that because they're sending their kids to the high school and they have a budget for this that they set aside every year. And if you look at the 2 tuition lines, the other tuition and the Portland Community College tuition, they're roughly the same amount of money last year as they are next year. And I'm just thinking it's a line item piece where they're thinking they're going to have more kids go to a different Portland State, perhaps. We have kids going to a lot of different places. Do you know that answer, Marlene?
Are you? It's not though. This year, 2024 estimated shows 354,000, and then 2025.
Oh, I think
is-
we're talking about two separate lines.
I think he's talking.
I'm talking about the
372
community
and
college.
372. If you put those together, it's equals about the same amount
Okay,
next year. They're just listed.
right, and I was looking at 371 and 372.
So, for the PCC, it's likely, I don't have this in front of me, but from what I'm seeing up here, it's also impacted by COVID. If those are EOP classes, the, courses that students can take, like some students take Japanese because we don't offer it here, but then we pay for them to do that. And so a lot of students didn't partake in that during COVID years. And so we're seeing an increase of students choose to do those kind of courses, which means it just is more expensive.
Okay.
Um,
And our total tuition cost between 372 and 374, I'll talk about 371 because it's a totally different situation. But 372 and 374, those tuition costs, when you add them together, are about the same over the 2 years. 371, that is tuition for students who we may need to place in those are typically for special education students that we need to place in a spot in another district or in another education agency. And those spots can be over $100,000 a year, and we never know from year to year how many of those spots we're going to need because we don't know who's going to enroll in our district or unenroll from our district. And so the reason there's a bigger budget there is actually being conservative in our special education department about making sure we have enough money to cover it. And you can see that those swing quite a bit from 349,000 to 512 to 352. And so we budgeted a lot of money in there because we just don't know it's very difficult to project.
I just, you know, when you're looking at everything itemized out, you know, and especially when you're looking at how tight things are already, every little bit counts and adds up. And I'm sure that's well under scrutiny, but I'm looking at mainly just focusing on the percentages of increase. And looking for explanations as to behind why the jumps.
well, it's kind of like conferences and workshops and professional development. Like I totally support both, but they've doubled the last 2 years in a row. So I don't know if that's because it's like we're coming out of COVID and there's more opportunity. So we're returning back to a more typical, or if it's like we just want to do more because we care about our staff and we want to offer them more professional development, which I support, but I'm like, I don't know what's creating that
Yeah.
influx.
So I think there's a couple things here. With it going down in fiscal year 23, so last year, we put the brakes on discretionary spending across the board. And so
Oh.
the fact that that would drop way down, not surprising. The other thing that we find oftentimes is that if I budget as a school principal $5,000 in my school budget for professional development for my staff, I often didn't spend it all because I didn't have the need for it, or I couldn't find substitutes to support teachers being gone or things of that nature. And so that is an area where we often underspend. And so we're comparing estimated expenditures for this year to budgeted expenditures for next year. And that's probably, I should probably do the percent change column in a different way now that I think about it and compare budget to budget, because there is a difference there.
Yeah, I think that would actually be really helpful, not for this year, but for next year to incorporate that, because there is, I think one of the kind of hallmarks of how we've approached things the last few years is to try to be really conservative on some of these estimates. And when we then compare our really conservative budget estimate to our well managed actual spending, like then it looks like we're all over the board when it's really, we're just constantly overshooting or undershooting. I don't know which way that actually works, but yeah.
I think that's well said.
And are we looking at like some major software revamp update coming up here in the next?
So that's one that I definitely wanted to talk about. So if you look at line 356, first of all, online subscriptions, you see that that goes from $213,000 to $0. And what we found was we were tracking our software in two places, online subscriptions and under computer software. And so we looked in, there's a thing called PBAM. It's the Program Budgeting and Accounting Manual for the state that gives you where to charge things. And you can put accounts in there, but 356 online subscriptions was not in there. And under the account, I think it's 470. I'd have to look down at the one you're talking about with sophomore, or 470 went way up. And so we moved everything into that one fund, which is according to the guidelines of where it's supposed to go. So that's just a kind of a cleanup of where things are supposed to go. It also helps us track things. We have to track all of our software leases in a separate way, and it helps to have them all in one account also, just from that way. But I think this is a tighter accounting way to do it according to the regulations set out by the state.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's still one heck of a jump though, like 340 something K, right? Man, if you look at it wrong. Well, 480, it's going to 488.
Yeah, we pulled about $200,000 out of online subscriptions.
So,
It's like 100-ish.
100,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's 100-ish.
So 3, yeah.
It's, do you know, I mean, our technology is getting incredibly expensive and we're more and more reliant upon it. Do you know what that might be?
I don't exactly know what it might be, but I'm assuming it is, we spent some of our ESSER dollars on things like Dreambox, which for the elementary level, which is a math software program. So it could be that as part of it. And then everything has escalated quite a bit for online subscriptions to anything. And quite a bit is like 100% when it comes to instructional materials. It's very expensive.
Is that also things like 2FA or other elements? I mean, is that? I mean, there's a lot more requirements.
Yeah,
for that.
there is some of that with our cyber policy. There's some more funds we have to spend. There's also a couple of Hapara or Opera, I think is how it's actually said, which is a software program that sort of help our teachers monitor what students are doing on their devices and other things. And we paid for that out of surplus funds for a couple of years and never had a budget item for it. And our tech director came to me this year and I said, can we please just put this in the budget so that I don't have to find $22,000, to pay for this. And so there's some of that kind of stuff in there too. That's one that I know of for sure that was not prior in the budget prior and is in there now.
And Gary, what is charter school payments?
So
Just generally.
we have a charter school, Sherwood Charter School, who's over here across the street from the old district office. And we collect revenue for the state for all of the students that they have. So they have about 220 students in there. We collect revenue from the state for those 220 students and we give 80% of that revenue back to them. That's what that payment is. That's their operating budget from us. Couple other line items that I'd like to point out that questions were asked and they were things I definitely wanted to get to anyway. If you look at 322 repair and maintenance services, you think, wow, we're spending 1.41 million and next year we're going down to 545,000. That's where our estimated expenditures for the ice storm are. So that's where we had a lot of repair needed. We're cutting checks to the contractor. The insurance company is reimbursing for those. Some of those we've actually paid and received. Some of those are just forecast out based on what we're hearing, but that's why that number is so different. We're not anticipating another ice storm. Maybe we should.
Just curious, how did the insurance coverage end up working out for the ice storm damage?
Well, it's not all finished yet. So we're working with our adjuster right now. We've submitted our funds. So we tracked all of our hours and all of our expenses that we had personally and have submitted those to the insurance company. So anything out of pocket for us, we're submitting to the insurance company. We have not received a check for all of those yet. We're sort of working on exactly what that's going to look like. Most of that is hours of our staff moving Middleton to the ridges and back and renting trucks and things of that nature. We cut a check for $250,000 to the contractor Balfour who did the work. And we received a check for $250,000 from the insurance company for that work. And our insurance adjuster is trying to wrap up that work. We're hoping to wrap it up by the end of the fiscal year. And that would require the work to be completed at Middleton by June 30th and then wrap up the billing and stuff in the summer and tie it up this fiscal year. I don't know if it'll happen or not, but we're working on it.
There's still wallpaper, carpet, and some wall boards to go this summer, as soon as the kids leave. So it's still an open ticket, so to speak.
It's still an open ticket. And if they can get that work done between the time the kids leave and June 30th, we'll wrap it up this fiscal year. If not, it'll drag over into next fiscal year, which is fine. I hope it doesn't, but it'd be fine if it does.
One last quick clarification, 0212, what exactly is PERS pickup?
PERS pickup. So that is the little bit of a complicated question. So no, it's okay. So PERS, as you know, is our retirement system. The district has a PERS obligation that they pay, and our employees also have a PERS obligation that they pay, which is 6%. But we negotiated with them several years ago that let me think about this so I don't say it backwards of what it actually is. We pay their PERS on their behalf. And they took a 6% pay reduction for us to do that. And the reason we did that was because in that 6% reduction, we don't pay Social Security, Medicare, or PERS on that 6% deduction, and it saves the district about $400,000 a year. So by making that change, it saves us a substantial amount of money. There's a lot more to that we'll save for another day, though.
Gary, just a quick question here. So I'm just more so looking at just the totals. And I know you said there was some bucketing between some of these different pluses and minuses between the two different groups, but just in general, supplies and materials up 25%. And that's just the kind of the number that I gravitated to, right? So not only just all the pluses and minuses, but just the overall increase. And it just seems like a big increase. Obviously, like FY23, the 1.2 million was probably because you halted spending, right? And that's an easy place to probably halt spending. But if you go back to FY22, you're still at 1.3 million in total supplies and materials. And now we're forecasting, or we're proposing to go to a little over 2 million. Just it's a large number with, the other in a budget constrained environment.
A lot of that is software, as you can see. So that's a big chunk of it. There's also escalation of costs, and this also is often one where we underspend. Not this year, but often this is one we underspend where people budget for supplies and they don't typically spend them all. It is a large jump. And a lot of this is we allocate discretionary budgets to the principals and the schools, which we escalated by 3% this year over last year. And then they allocate those funds. And a lot of this is where they chose to allocate those funds. We limit their total amount, but we don't dictate where within certain funds they put it.
And forgive me if you've already mentioned this, is that for the same software we had last year, or is that for new software? Because I know everything's going up in price.
It's both. There is some new software in there. There's some software that was paid for, as Marlene mentioned, by grants for some of our kids that have come back into the general fund. One we paid out of just kind of surplus funds every year, and then escalation of costs. I imagine there's some cybersecurity stuff in there. We do take out an extra cyber policy over and above the one that comes with our general package, and there's a lot of things we have to do for that as well.
And then there's also the 213,000 that's getting reclassed down. And so
Yeah.
is there anything else getting reclassed into supplies and materials, or?
Not that I can think of right now.
So that probably makes it 15% or 12, should be, I need an
Yeah,
Excel
and
spreadsheet.
that's what I deal with a
Yeah.
lot too. So typically, and something I might suggest going forward is if we do have significant reclasses, is just make those in the prior year or make a separate column that says, hey, this was the actual, and then this is where we reclassed from this line item to that line item. So then you're looking at apples to apples, because a lot of these fluctuations that we're talking about are explanations of reclassification.
Yeah, that's a great call.
But we love the detail, so thank you.
You bet.
This is a good amount of detail that we haven't seen in past years.
I actually don't know if I've ever heard so many questions asked in a budget meeting before, so.
Well, that's the idea.
Good too.
We want to, if we want to catch them now and, you know, and any feedback you do have about this process, about any of this stuff, I'd love to have it. If you think about it later, shoot me an email. We're trying to get better every year and improve the wheel.
I just will tell you, I'm very thankful for all your work and how detailed it is, because in my 3 years in the board, this is, this year alone with you working so closely and itemizing things out, I have a way better understanding of all of this.
Good.
So,
I'm glad to hear that.
thank you.
Yeah, it feels a little nitpicky, when we're going through them, but I'm like, trying to remind you guys that the rest of us don't work at a school, so we don't understand what these things cost, yeah. And I'm guessing if people at home are paying attention, they also have no idea what any of these things cost, so if we're asking, they probably have the same questions.
Well, and that's the idea. Let's make it transparent. Let's get it out and let's get the questions on the table.
For
That's,
sure.
that's part of the reason we chose to do it in 2 meetings. Let's kind of go over the big picture in one, and then let's get after it in the official budget committee meeting and look more at the details.
Yeah, it's very appreciated.
You know, to use a school analogy, you know, you're always hardest on your best student. And so you've done a lot of great work, and so your
You guys are
reward
being
is a bunch
easy
of
on me,
questions
so
for
what does
us.
that
Yeah.
say? So another question that was asked was about insurance premiums down in the 600s in the general fund expenses, and why those are going up so fast, and do we shop around for those? And I think we talked before about why they're going up so fast, just the pool of disasters across the nation, and that's hammering everybody. And can we shop around? The answer is sort of yes and no. The answer is yes, in that we do have insurance agents who shop around for us. Most of our insurance comes from PACE, which is a shared risk pool of all the school districts in the state of Oregon. And their whole mission is to keep rates low and protections good without any profit motives. And so we get better rates through them than we can get on the private sector, and the bulk of our insurance comes out of that pool. There are limitations to that, though. For example, we have $1 million cyber policy through them, but that $1 million cyber policy has an aggregate cap of like $15 million. So if all the school districts in the state get hacked, they're only liable for $15 million, which I don't think that's very likely that we're all going to get hit at the same time. But nonetheless,
Don't
we
say
take,
that out loud.
but nonetheless, we are paranoid. So we take out another $1 million policy, $1 to $2 million, depending on the incident, on top of that. Not only because we want the extra coverage, but because it also requires us to do a lot of things. And sort of the theory behind it is, if the people who are managing risk to the point where they're willing to insure you for a couple $1 million tell you what you're doing is safe, it's more likely than if we just, does that make sense? So it's a twofold process to take out the insurance for the insurance, but also for the guidance and the help us do what we have to do. So those kinds of things we'll actually shop the private market for, and bits and pieces of our insurance from the private market. The bulk of it comes from that pool of PACE.
And is there also things in place? There's also prevention. So if you talk cyber insurance, there's also training that can be provided to teachers and everything, because a lot of phishing attacks happen. And so if there's training to help potentially prevent a cyber attack, is that also in place and part of this?
For sure.
Yeah.
And that's actually part of when to get a cyber policy, you have to commit to very specific trainings and doing very specific things. At least the policies that we've gotten. And so we do put those things in place, and we're pretty cautious about that.
Gary?
Also extended in some format to the students, just out of curiosity. I mean, is there any talk of that? Because like I'm a middle-aged woman, and my work does, fake phishing attack, like emails all the time, and I'm like, yay, I got it, but the kids, right, they're on our software. So is that education also passed along to them?
The students receive a series of digital citizenship lessons in their homeroom, advisory, or for elementary, just in their regular scheduled day.
Gary, a quick question for you, just on the associated payroll costs in the unemployment tax line item. That's a big jump as well. And I was wondering, is that the result of that SB 849, I think is what it is.
That is a result of the change in law. So,
That's what I thought.
and I was asked the question about, we talked about $800,000 and why is there only 696,000 there? The other 100,000 comes out of the special revenue fund where we employ about 60 people, about 10% of our staff. So those funds will then be essentially transferred more or less into the 600 fund, and we'll pay our liabilities related to unemployment out of that fund. So that's exactly what that is.
Okay.
Any more questions on any of that?
I have one other question. What's the huge jump in miscellaneous expenses?
That was the one where I talked about with the student body funds moving kind of in and out, and that would have been the perfect case for Ryan's point about showing those reclassifications, but that's what that is.
Okay.
And it's higher now than it has been in the past because we're not collecting those course fees anymore, and we're paying those out of our general fund revenue so that kids shouldn't have to pay to take courses. Okay, well, we'll move on to just at a summary level, the other funds. This is a summary of our 200 funds. This is a fund where all of our grants sit again. You notice there's a
Gary,
pretty,
can I interrupt with the one really quick?
yeah,
This is probably the best place to ask this question, but I've had a couple people in the community, just because we're talking about the general fund, and I'm assuming this is where it would end up. But I've had a few members of the community ask about the Bowman House and just kind of what the status is on the Bowman House project or program at the district.
thank you for asking that. It's
Yeah.
an interesting question. I just met with, I had a phone call with John Dickover, who's run that program and started it for years, and Adam Mitchell, the high school principal, the other day. And we were just working on some technical things around like bonding and contractor's license and stuff like that, preparing for what's next in that. A few years ago, the district actually bought a house near the old high school, near the current middle school, that we were thinking we could perhaps tear down and build a new Bowman House on that. It turned out the lot didn't quite work for that with the setbacks and things like that. We held that lot for a couple years. We sold it this year because it didn't work out. Actually worked out pretty well because real estate prices went up faster than we would have earned if we'd kept that money in the bank. So we made a tidy little profit on it, and we've got about $400,000 sitting in a Bowman House fund right now, actually in the 400 funds. And so our next move, Mr. Dickover's been working on ramping stuff up with his construction classes. And our biggest barrier is land, honestly, for that. And we're working on a few things behind the scenes for some ideas for some land, but that is the challenge with that program. But we are working on it. And the hope is to get it fired back up sooner rather than later.
Perfect. I just wanted to ask because I didn't see that in the budget, but I know that that's something that people in the community have asked about.
Yeah, I did not provide the excruciating detail for all the funds outside of the 100 fund. I mean, I could have, but it gets even a little bit wonkier with all the grants and things.
Is there still talk of some landowners that are,
That would be ideal. I don't really know the status of that, to be honest with you, but
okay,
land donation would be fantastic.
okay, I'll circle back with you.
That would be fantastic.
Okay,
And really, the idea is if you can get a chunk of land where you can build several houses, you can build a sustainable program out of it. We've been doing a one-off thing, and so we're looking at some ideas.
yeah, and I know that I was part of some conversations, so I will circle back with you on that.
Perfect. Appreciate that very much. Does that answer your question?
Oh, yeah. No,
Okay,
I
perfect.
just figured since we're here to talk about the budget and that wasn't explicitly here, just it's a nice place to give an update.
Perfect. So here's our special revenue funds. These are largely pass-through funds. You see a pretty good jump in revenue this year. Part of that comes from because we count our beginning and ending fund balance as part of revenue, or our beginning fund balance as part of revenue. And last year we paid off $1.3 million in deficits, and this year we're transferring another $1.4 million in to start building reserves for things like textbooks, turf field replacement, other things of that nature. And we also had some grants go up in funding. We got a little bit more out of our SIA grant, a little bit more out of our Major 98 grant, and some other grants. Some other grants went down as well, but the net was actually an increase in total grant funds. So good news on that. This is largely a pass-through account where funds come in for a specific purpose. They're spent on a specific thing. It's a fund that's growing on us over time, though, as more money comes into it.
So I did notice that in looking at the description of the funds, like replacement of turf fields, that wouldn't go in under capital.
That's actually in the 400 funds. I think I misspoke on that one.
Okay.
That sits in the 400 funds. Yeah.
Curious about that, because there was two things that jump out, which is purchase services and supplies and materials, even though, I mean, those are huge jumps right there. Can you just give some brief explanation of what falls under those categories?
Under purchase services and supplies and materials. A whole bunch of different things. In this case, we just appropriated those extra funds. There were funds in there, like in the construction excise tax account, that we couldn't really appropriate because we had a negative account balance in there. And so I'd have to look and get into the details of that. I can't tell you every penny that's in there on those accounts.
Okay, but not every penny. So what was like a general idea of what those funds go towards?
So we pay for a lot of our buses out of the construction excise tax account, which is a 200 fund. What else did we appropriate in there?
Are you talking about that or purchase services?
I'm talking about expenditures under the 200 special funds. So I'm looking at line 3, purchase services and supplies and materials. I'm just wondering what things fall under those
So
categories.
purchase services is I'm just trying to think of what purchase services, and I'm sorry I can't answer this off the top of my head. I didn't look at it in that regard. I managed it more by the fund than by the
apologize, I
expenditure.
didn't send that to you in advance.
No, that's okay. The one thing I can tell you is this fund is largely a pass-through fund. Funds come in the form of grants. We spend it on what the grant allows us to buy, and it goes out the other end. It's not
It's not essentially, we're not looking at this as a cost to the district.
it's not anything that's going to affect our general fund.
Okay,
And part of it is when we had those deficit balances, for example, of $1.3 million, we could not appropriate those funds because we had a negative balance in the fund. And so when we just took our funds and appropriated all of the funds, like in the construction excise tax account and in the energy efficiency account and some of these other accounts, that's just the way it played out in there. I should have probably looked into that in more detail for this meeting, and I apologize for that.
but what I'm hearing though is what matters is looking at the revenue and looking at the expenditure and making sure that our expenditures are falling under what the revenue is, because their money's coming from grants and then just passing through, like you said.
They will for sure.
Okay.
And for example, this year, we're going to spend $3 million, about less than we budgeted on expenditures in this account, and carry over about $3 million in the 200 funds.
Okay.
And I would guess the same will be more or less true next year. And that's a variety of funds that we're spending down, but
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I
No,
didn't send that
it's
to you ahead of
okay.
time, but I really, I just need.
I
to
should
understand.
be able to answer it. I focus most of my energy preparing for this on the general fund and putting the budget together.
No,
And
Just to make
this is
sure.
honestly the trickiest fund of them all to manage, because you've got 30 or 40 grants in it and a bunch of other funds with real specific expenditures, and they have to be spent on those specific things. And it's actually the most complicated to balance and manage from my perspective.
So just to make sure I'm understanding this, so the revenue and expenditures here are kind of tautologically the same. We're gonna get these grant funds, and then we're gonna go through the general fund and find costs that qualify under the grant. And so if our grants went up by $5 million next year, our expenses would go up by $5 million.
Correct.
We would find expenses that qualify under the grant and move them
Correct.
to
Or
it.
hire new staff or purchase new materials or whatever the thing that the grant called for.
And so that is, so one of the hard things, so this is when we talk about all of the work that Salem makes people do and how confusing and onerous it is, like that's why it's hard to answer the questions here. It's not because of, this isn't the way we would set it up. This is the way we're funded. And so we have to comply. Is that a fair characterization?
I think that's a fair characteristic of it. Yeah. I'm sorry, I can't answer your question more specifically. Okay, okay. Okay, the one thing I would say is that I do not believe this fund has a lot of financial risk for the district. As long as we manage each of our grants the way we're supposed to and spend the funds that come in and no more, we're in good shape. Okay, on to the debt services fund. So this is the fund where we collect property taxes to pay back our general obligation bonds that we use to purchase, to build a new high school and do other things with. We also have a PERS bond that we pay out of there. You'll notice that our change in revenue is only 1.77%, even though our payment goes up by more like 4.64% if you look at the expenditure side. That's because this year we had to bring in a little bit more in revenue because we started the year with $46,000 in that fund with a $18 million liability. And we need a little bit more cushion than that. So we levied a little bit more funds this year in this account. We built up our balance and our levy will go back down this year. And so the good news for our taxpayers is that when we built the new high school, the number that we gave the taxpayers was we charged them $4.20 per thousand of assessed value. In 22-23, it was $3.44 per thousand, so 76 cents less. And we will be able to go back down this year as we're levying even fewer dollars. So it's good conservative estimates on the front end before I was in this role have proven to have benefits for our taxpayers in terms of paying less than what we told them. And I would expect our levy rate per thousand will come down this year. This is on the general obligation bonds. This is different than the local option levy. This is on the funds we use. We borrow money to build the high school. This is paying those funds back. And that rate should go down for folks this year, which is good news. And the capital projects fund. This is where we fund things like facilities and construction, instructional materials, technology. There's not a lot of revenue coming into that fund next year. The only revenue you see there is the local sources fund. The rest is fund balance. It's going to be carried forward from the prior year. The reason we had more revenue this year is because we sold the house the Bowman house, and put those funds in there and earned some interest as well. So that fund as well, not a lot of risk to the district beyond just these funds are dwindling and we're going to have to support this out of the general fund over time.
What are the, what are some of the, this is what we're gonna have to do that's falling into these expenditures that we're forecasting?
So can you ask your question again? I want to make sure I understand it.
What are some of the priority items that are falling under this fund that we're looking at imminently for this budget?
So for this budget cycle, I don't think anything is imminent this budget cycle that we're going to, with the possible exception of we need to start paying for a curriculum out of a curriculum fund, which we have in the 200 funds. We have about $500,000 sitting in the 200 funds in a curriculum instructional materials replacement fund. As those funds run down though in this, we have about $500,000 left in here, more than $500,000. We'll spend a lot of that this year on those adoptions that you'll vote on at the next board meeting. And some of the future adoptions will be paid for a little bit out of this account, but they're going to have to transfer in the next budget cycle into a special revenue fund account. And that's where these transfers that we did not talk about
I suppose I should have rephrased my question. So when I'm saying this, I mean this report. So like I'm seeing Jim, look like you want to answer, so go for it. But this budget report here for 2024, 2025, where I'm seeing expenditures of, 5.6 million in 2025.
I see what you're asking. Okay.
So what are the things that we've anticipated those funds are gonna be used for?
So in this fund, it's been our practice for years back. We just appropriate all of the funds in here every year, not knowing what's coming up. But what I think we'll spend money on this year, and this will be some curriculum in 24, 25, some technology in 24, 25, and deferred maintenance. And those might total $1 million or so. But revenues have to equal expenditures, and we could have put it in contingency if we wanted to and set it aside, but we don't know exactly what's going to come up in maintenance and facilities, for example, that we'll have to spend money on. We know some of the projects, but not all of them. Does that make sense?
Well, that's what I was gonna add is we continue to have HVAC issues, so heating and ventilation issues that we kind of address as needed. We don't have any major projects for the next budget cycle in terms of roofs. Those kinds of things are really big numbers that you might see. And so holding these kind of in reserve almost, as Gary's pointing out, is a great option for the maintenance side. So it's deferred maintenance, but some of it is even further out. We were fortunate enough during the bond cycle to really address the vast majority of our roofing issues. And while we have leaks here and there, which is fairly normal, we've had those roofs, even the older ones, recently assessed by an outside organization. And they came back with good news, which is that we are pushing that because of the maintenance my team has done on the buildings over the years. We've pushed that need for future roofs out further. So likely from the maintenance side, it's really going to be HVAC issues more than anything. And those we're kind of dealing with as they come, and we'll have to look at kind of bigger, longer term issues here, probably the next 5 years or so, in terms of really planning for, all right, what are we going to do to replace the whole kit and caboodle at Archer Glen or pick a building.
And so things like security enhancements and stuff like that would, if they were to happen, would fall under the 400, right?
More than likely, yes.
Any money for the boardroom heating?
If you're cold, let me know. I'll pull up my computer and we'll take care of it.
And we do have some reasonably substantial reserves in the 200 funds already for those in terms of curriculum and technology replacement. We've got $500,000. We've got a fund that we get rebates for energy efficient projects we did when we built the new high school that's got close to $500,000 in it that can be spent on capital things. We've got a construction excise tax fund that's got about $800,000 in it that can be spent on capital goods. So there are monies that we've been saving and building sitting in that 200 fund to help us with this, but we're going to need to continue to add to it more aggressively than we have.
And do we get, there's tax incentives, right, for like electric school buses and stuff like that too?
There are some incentives for that, yes.
So are we cycling those? How are you managing that?
Yes, please.
There are a number of programs out there that will partially subsidize the purchase of buses or subsidize part of the installation of the equipment you need to charge them. We have looked into it, and our kind of outgoing director of transportation did a fair amount of studies with it, and we found that because we are such a hilly community,
Yeah.
the buses and the technology isn't quite there for this community. If we were a flat district with relatively short routes, we could probably make it work. We're probably a few years out before we're comfortable bringing one of those on.
Okay.
And they're very expensive.
Yeah.
They're $700,000 for a bus, and they're very, very heavy. And so I actually worry about what infrastructure impacts we'd have on our community roads by running those heavy buses
Yeah.
out, particularly into more of our rural areas.
I can speak to that. Our infrastructure is not qualified to handle any of
I'm sorry, what was that?
Yeah, our current infrastructure for safety is not qualified to handle that weight at this. In fact, it'll tear through it like it's paper.
That's good to know.
And that's the line of work Ben is in, so he has very good knowledge on that area.
Of it is.
No.
Gary, just a quick follow-up on that. So now that we are entering a cycle where we're going to have to start setting more money aside every year for these kind of capital expenditures, it is probably worth, not this time, but as we into the next budget cycle, thinking about, how do we make clear what's the money that we're spending versus what's the money that we're saving. And yeah, I don't know if there's like a common, we can just call it all contingency, or just to make it really clear to people, where sometimes it may look like we're just spending every penny that we get, when in actuality, that's just kind of the way the accounting is set up. And if there's
Yeah.
a way to make it clear to people.
That
what we're
makes
saving,
good
yeah.
sense. Yeah, I agree. And just to be clear, we didn't talk about this before. This is back to the 100 fund. And these are the transfers we're making for next year. So a couple of these transfers are operational transfers to the 200 funds, 200 nutrition services and athletics funds. Those are just the cost to operate those programs to the district on an annual basis. The other funds, to the textbook technology fund, bus replacement fund, and turf reserve fund, all of those are saving money for future years when we have to start relying upon the general fund to support these capital needs. And we'll need to invest more than this. We'll need to increase this amount in future years, but the idea is to just get it to be a line item in our budget and start building reserves so that we don't just hit a wall and have all these expenses at once, that we start saving now and ramp up to it. But it is a significant expenditure. Oops, I went too fast. I was very excited. Okay. On to the all funds function. This just summarizes each of the funds by function, gives you an FTE, full-time equivalent, certification or count there. And this is just another way to look at the same numbers we've seen in a different sort of category. The next page just shows our staffing by employee group by fiscal year. So we've got a few less staff in the budget this year. And then just our tax and levy rates. The permanent rate, the first one is fixed by law and stays permanent. It's called the permanent rate for a reason. Our local option rate, which you know about, and then we talked about the general obligation bond levy amount. And then I did put a couple of slides at the very end of the book that I wanted to show. And one is just, I think it's important that people see what percentage of our budget is salaries and benefits. When you look at this chart, it's a huge percent. And when you take the transfers out, some of which pay for salaries too, in the case of athletics, we're pretty close to 85, 84% of our total budget is really spent on people in the general fund, which is a big percentage. And when you think about those purchase services being things like insurance, electricity, water, each of those are knocking on the door of $1 million a piece. There's not a lot of wiggle room in there in terms of making reductions. And that's why when we look at reductions, we often look at people. I will tell you, I can't remember if I said this in the prior meeting, when we knew we were making reductions this year, all the principals, because they're smart, said, can't we take it out of our discretionary funds? And I said, no, it has to come out of people. And the reason being is if we need to cut more next year, it's much easier to cut supplies and materials in August than it is people. And so that's a little bit of that's part of that rationale, but there's not a ton in that other 17%. I think it's important that people see that. And then You notice there's a lot of staff, when you look at things by function, there's the instruction function, which is obviously our teachers and things like that. There's also a lot of staff in the 2000 functions and under support services. And I just wanted to break that down so people knew what that looked like. And so, there is instructional staff in there. That's things like our instructional coaches. There's student support, which is our counselors, mental health specialists, people who deal with like student wellness, nurses, things of that nature. School administration is our principals and administrators at the schools. And then half of it is just maintenance, transportation, fiscal services, my department, things of that nature. Business services, HR is in there as well. I just wanted to break that down so you and folks at home knew what was in that other fund, and that when you're looking at all those funds and supports, what do those people actually do? And that's the last slide I have for you today.
I feel like
survived.
It's important to call out that under 2,300 exec admin and board, we do not take a salary or we do not get paid for our positions.
Yeah,
So,
there is.
I just was worried that by somebody looking at that label, they may think that we are getting paid to do this.
Yeah, no, you have the hardest volunteer job I know of.
Just want to make sure that has
and-
not changed.
And that has not changed. And that includes the things that go in the kind of the board's budget are things like legal fees, our audit fees, executive team salaries, things of that nature, but nothing to do with board compensation whatsoever.
But I just know we confused people this last year because we approved the stipend
Yeah.
that was put forward and then we retracted that, or, so I just wanted to make sure people watching knew that we were not getting a stipend for these services.
Just
Perfect.
tell people all the board compensation is in the supplemental retirement category.
So I just had a question in general. So going back to the special education instructional assistant. So if you can maybe flip back to that first foil that you had showed, Gary. When it just talked about overall sped students increasing.
The first slide.
The very first one, yeah, just to circle back, overall sped students we're expecting to increase. Overall, we are not gonna hire the 3 people that we tried to hire this year. That's fine, we didn't have them this year. There's also gonna be a decrease of 1.41 FTEs. So, and I know Marlene, we talked about it last time, like we're under obligation to provide all these kids on IAs, IEPs, the services that they're required. So do we think that with the incremental sped students and the decrease of 1.41 FTEs, that we're gonna have enough FTEs to support our sped students? And that's the first question. The second question is, if we don't, then what choices do we have to make in order to support them from a legal perspective?
So I'm glad you asked that question. So there's a couple things going on here. For one, we've already started looking at ways that we can shift some staff within our budget to, instead of some positions that we were going to hire for other purposes, hire them for special education purposes. And we can do that without really any loss of service or substantive loss of service. We've got some grant funds we can direct to. So we're working on ways to at least put ourselves in a position, if we find when we do our staffing analysis, we need those positions, we would be in a position to have those ready to go. The other thing I didn't really talk about too much is, and I can't remember what I've talked to so many people about this issue. I don't remember if I talked about it in our last budget committee meeting or not last week, but we did also take and add 2.7 certified staff to the special education side of the house. That was sort of a reallocation of some other positions. So they will have boots on the ground, 2.7 more certified staff next year than they had this year. And ideally, we restore those 1.41 IA staff, and so they're net ahead. And we may need to do more than that even, depending on how it shakes out and how many sped kids we get, and we'll have to be nimble on that. But we are planning for that because we are concerned about that as well.
Okay, that's helpful. I hadn't heard about the 2.7 incremental, so that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I didn't do a good job of explaining that last time, so. And those were positions that were also unhired last year that were reallocated. So they were in the budget. So it's not an add to the budget, but it's an ad to boots on the ground who's actually doing the work.
Have we been able to hire for that or do we not know still?
For those 2.7,
Yeah,
I think they've probably hired, I think they've hired them all.
that's awesome. Okay, good.
Just as a kind of aside to that conversation, I mean, it doesn't have anything to do with what we're doing here, but hopefully we can communicate to, you know, whoever it is who lobbies in Salem, some of the ways the ins and outs of grant funding actually make accountability hard at a board level, because it's difficult to keep track of stuff moving around back and forth. And that this is not, I mean, you're doing a great job of managing a bad process, but hopefully there are ways we can communicate that this is difficult for people to understand and to follow from year to year. And it's a direct result of how they are choosing to fund some of these initiatives.
I was in a meeting today with the Oregon Association of School Business Officials. They're kind of broken into zones, and we meet periodically over lunch. And so we had a meeting today, and this was the nature of the conversation around working to lobby and make some changes, because there's some changes coming in the way that a lot of these things are accounted for, and we're trying to get our voice at the table so that the business office has a voice in how that's done. And it appears right now there's only one person from the business office community on this committee that's looking at the way of redoing things, and it's largely instructional staff, which the instructional staff definitely needs to be there because a lot of the accountability is on them, but the business staff needs to be there too and have our voice at the table, because it's becoming the monster that eats itself. It's hard to manage. So there's a lobbying effort going on at sort of a state level and in that one, and there were plans being made today about how best to proceed with those plans. And some very frustrated folks, by the way. Any more questions or concerns?
I guess one of the concerns that Matt brought up earlier, and I'm now getting back to this glorious detail here in the last 100
Yeah,
pages.
amazing.
And I think it would be good if we're trying to increase transparency of potentially allocating, because I'm looking now when we were discussing the capital projects fund. If we do have some funds in there, that's more of a reserve than actually earmarked for these expenses, to actually call those a contingency or something else. Because right now it's showing like computer hardware estimated proposed at 4.1 million. And if we're not actually, if those aren't earmarked to spend up to that 4 million, or if it's, you know, 300 grand or whatever, be able to not call it out as computer hardware and call it kind of what
Contingency.
it is, contingency, I think.
Yeah, I think that's. Well, it also brings me back to the board if I want to spend more than we said we were going to spend, and then you're authorizing those expenditures. And I can certainly make that change in future years, or we could do something different this year, whatever you.
Personally, I would rather we took a little time and thought through it, because I do think we're entering a shift. So with transitioning off the high school bond funds to pay for these capital projects toward more of our operating revenue paying for these capital costs, we should probably take some time and think about how we want to manage and present this and working in next year rather than do it at the last minute this year.
Okay.
And can I ask a question, Gary? Can this document that you provided here with all the background, can we have this prior to this meeting, or do you have this established in the meeting that we had the other week, or does this take time to put that together and that's where?
You know, we sent it out with the agenda on Friday of last week, but I didn't specifically send it to all of you. So it is certainly available a week before the meeting. And I probably should have emailed the whole thing to you. But we typically publish the budget document. We have to publish it 5 days before the meeting, so it's all there. Well, and, you know, among the many learnings for me in the last couple of weeks, one has been around just orientation of new budget committee members. And if I could go back in time a month, I would have loved to sit down with the two of you and just had a cup of coffee and gone through, here's what this looks like, here's what we're up to. And my apologies for that. So it's not that you're the new guy, it's that the guy who's been here for a couple of years didn't quite get her done. Well, I have been a little busy, but that's all right. It would have been a simple, you know, it's a learning. It's just, you just get back on the horse the next day and move forward.
And that could be a nice procedural change for next year, just an email to the commit, like whenever these are printed, just to say, oh, if you want to swing by the district office and pick up your hard copy a week before or whenever it is they're ready.
Yeah.
Feel free to swing by the office.
You all right?
Yeah.
No problem. And yeah, we didn't actually have the hard copies a week in advance, like bound up and stuff, but I could easily print one out. We could get them out the door. It's not a problem.
All right, is there any other discussion? There's a lot of people in the audience. I'm not sure if we have any public comment. Any electronic
There
submissions?
is no public comment.
Okay, we're gonna just breeze through that section then on public comment. I don't know if you're supposed to be running this portion or I am. You're the chair of the, yeah. Take it over.
So are we to the action? Oh, deliberation? So does anyone want to deliberate about any of the items that we've talked about thus far?
Move to close deliberation.
Right. So move on to the approvals. I guess as chair, move that the budget committee approve the proposed budget for the 24-25 or for 24-25 as submitted by the superintendent with no changes.
I second.
Can he call for a motion, or does he have to call for a motion, or can he make the motion himself?
So I think technically as the chair, you ask if there's a motion and then someone
Oh.
else in the committee will make the first
Is
and second.
there a motion to,
I recommend that I've never done this before, actually. That we move, the budget committee approve the proposed budget for 2024-25 as submitted by the superintendent with no changes.
I will second that motion. I will second that motion.
all those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, is the motion carries? Oh, I get to bang the gavel. Do we have a motion to approve the property tax levies for 24-25?
I move to approve the 2024-25 levy of the district's permanent rate of $4.8123 per $1,000 of assessed value. Also, move to approve the local option levy for $1.50 per $1,000 of assessed value and move to approve the levy amount of $17,232,569 for debt services.
Is there a second?
I second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carries 10-0.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate your service. I appreciate your questions and digging into this, and I appreciate your feedback. And I welcome more via email or conversation going forward just on how we can improve this process.
I appreciate this report. I don't really actually like numbers. I do them all day long, but this report is just glorious and it's so much better than it's been before. And I actually told Abby, I hope my husband's not watching because I pay more attention to this budget than our budget. So, but it's really nice. So thank you for all of your hard work and the details and all of it.
My pleasure. Thank you much.
So this is my third year on the committee, and it's night and day different what we just went through than what we did the first time. Great job.
And thank you.
All right,
Being adjourned.
good job.
Just, well, before we adjourn, just to clarify for the listening audience, because the budget was approved tonight, the tentative budget dates held for the 29th and 30th for additional meetings will be canceled.